So, a Bible geek here, also known, I suppose, as the Gnostic geek. Not that I am an expert on this, but I have read loads of books on it and have always been fascinated by it. And this is used to be called in the early church the Hydra-headed heresy, meaning that there were so many different varieties of it. And the defenders, the apologists for emerging Catholic orthodoxy, tried to explain this away by saying, well, you see, it was like a cottage industry, and all the different Gnostic gurus like Simon Magus, Valentinus, Basilides, Saturninus, etc. I mean, there are loads of them. They tried to say, you see, all these guys were it's like the old, well, they didn't use this analogy, they couldn't have, but if you've ever heard the one about the laundryman who stayed in business only by taking in each other's wash. Well, that's kind of the way they put it. And Walter Bauer is really good on this in his terrific, earth-shaking book, Orthodoxy and Heresy in Earliest Christianity. He said this was a polemical device to marginalize Gnosticism. It was a way of saying, well, it's just a bunch of weirdos that were just handing it on one to the other, but that's really it. It's nothing really to worry about, though. We got to worry about it because there's a lot of Gnostics and they're making trouble simply by preaching their stuff. And today we have somebody taking that a bit further, and I think a little too far, by saying, you know, it's time to deconstruct the whole category of Gnosticism because it's like a catch-all, and it's a way of, again, of saying, yeah, it's just a private little conventicle of nuts over here, whereas it looks more like that what you've got is a whole bunch of different early Christian options or different versions of early Christianity. It's not like they were all deviations from something like the Apostles' Creed. That is already to be accepting the party line, the propaganda line of emerging Catholicism. Yeah, we're the real thing. These guys have just come up with brand X, brand Z, brand Q, etc. And I can understand that, but personally, I think that is killing a mouse with an elephant gun. To say that Gnosticism, that there was no such thing, that's going too far. It's like as if, I mean, yeah, there are a bunch of different Gnostic groups. Some of them actually called themselves Gnostics, those in the know. Others didn't and just called themselves Christians. And their subtitle might be, yeah, we're Valentinians. We follow Valentinus, who, of course, was the disciple of a disciple of Paul named Theudas. And who knows if that's true, though the Valentinians claimed it. But they saw themselves as apostolic Christians. What the heck? Why not? And a great book on this is David Litwa, Litwa, and who I would love to have on this show, but he's been so bullied by the Act Blue censorship crowd that he dares not, for the sake of his livelihood, and I can't, say he's wrong to do that. He has to be careful, because if he should show up in the bad company of yours truly, he might lose his job. That's happened to him before, by the way, not because of me, but because of his pioneering and courageous new look at the evidence. So, okay, don't want to get lost off the trail here. There were a lot of phenomena, a lot of different sectarian groups, some of whom called themselves Gnostics, all of whom were called Gnostics, and understandably so. That is, early Catholic theologians just lumped them all together and slapped the label Gnosticism on it, whether they used it or not. But they weren't totally off the track, because all these groups had certain basic things in common that certainly Catholic Christianity did not like and still doesn't. So it's a tricky thing. In one sense, yes, to just say, yeah, they're all the same, that is embracing the old party line. We're the real thing. They're just some kind of weird mutation off in the corner somewhere. No. They were different types of early Christianity, not necessarily related to one another at all, though sharing certain broad similarities. Now, what are those similarities? What do these groups have in common? Well, what I want to do is to set forth a kind of ideal type of Gnosticism that contains the basic elements that you find in most of the groups called Gnostic. They all are partisans of a secret knowledge, hence Gnostic, from gnosko, to know, or gnosis, knowledge. That could be any old knowledge, how to fix your car or something, right? But they used it in a specialized sense of elite, privileged knowledge. Not that they're trying to keep it from people, and not that they're trying to just sit on it like the scholars who were given the Dead Sea Scrolls to decipher. And it took like over 40 years for these guys to publish them, because they just kept it in their own little province, and they were the elite. And finally, Robert Eisenman and some others managed to break their lock on the thing and translate them and publish them. Well, that's not what the Gnostics wanted to do, but there was an element of secrecy, because Gnosticism Gnostics believed that their knowledge of the truth was higher knowledge than most Christians, Jews, pagans, etc., realized. That they had all these other religions weren't bad. They were good, but they didn't come from the ultimate God. They came rather from lower beings who ruled the nations of the earth and who set forth the laws for those societies. Therefore, they didn't want chaos. They didn't want evil, but they did want the worship of the human race. And so they gave them the laws and pretended to be the ultimate gods. And so they had enslaved mankind. And in the New Testament, you have talk of this, because there's certainly Gnostic elements in the canonical scriptures, right? And so they rightly, I guess they learned this through bitter experience. They figured what we have to say would so upset the common religious person. And let's just talk about Christianity here at the moment, though similar problems happened in Islam and Judaism. With their esoteric doctrines like the Kabbalah and Sufism and so on. But they knew that most people would find what they had to say so shocking that they would consider it not only heresy, but blasphemy. They'd say, hey, you can't get away with saying that. You're defaming God. Were they? Well, Gnostics did generally believe that the world of human beings was created by what Plato already referred to as the demiurge, which means a craftsman. And there was, even for Plato, there was a higher deity, the good, he called it. And that one did not create the world of matter or of human beings. It was lesser deities who did. Well, that's what Gnosticism said. But most people wouldn't have believed that, right? The ones the Gnostics said were merely angels. or subordinates. That's who most Jews, Christians, etc. worship. They just didn't realize it. Jews didn't understand that there was a God, as Paul Tillich used to say, a God beyond the God of theism. And mankind is kept ignorant of that because the beings that run the show, the archons or rulers, the principalities and powers, etc. These wanted the worship from the beings, after all, they had created. And so let's take a step back. Oh, yeah, I just want to give you a couple of examples of what they were afraid of. To dip into Sufism a good bit later, centuries later, the Sufis call themselves Gnostics too. And the earliest ones were pretty much pantheistic. They believed that there was nothing but God and that all of us were part of God, faces of God. And so Al-Hallaj, one of the great Sufi mystics, was overcome with this knowledge, and he went about almost in a trance, making declarations, including, "I am the truth." And that was one of the epithets for Allah, for God. And some people heard him and said, what? What is this guy saying? On the one hand, they probably thought, he's insane. He belongs in a straitjacket. But you know what can happen with zealous Muslims? They interpreted it as blasphemy. This guy is saying that he is Allah. Hey, that's just rank blasphemy. So Al-Hallaj got crucified, and actually that was only the beginning of the horrors they inflicted on him. Well, his fellow Sufis said, "What the heck was he thinking? How did he not see what had to happen?" Because he was a pantheist, right? He didn't mean he was God in a way that you were not. He just was aware of it as a mystic, whereas most people are clueless about it. But his colleagues said, "There's no way they could understand that." That isn't even a value judgment exactly. It's just the fact. Most people have never heard of this, and they're not going to like it if they do. Al-Hallaj should have known that. Everybody else among the Sufis was careful to speak of this only among themselves. Well, this is a problem for all Gnostics, and I think of one of my favorite sayings from the Gospel of Thomas. I think it's saying 13. Yeah, where Jesus says to the disciples, "Make a comparison. Tell me who I am like." And so Peter says, "Well, you're like a wise philosopher." Matthew says, "You're like a righteous angel." And that those were actually the views of some early Christians. And then Thomas says, "Master, I'm stumped. My mouth isn't capable of putting into words what you are like." And Jesus says, "That's what I wanted to hear." He said, "Blessed are you. You needn't call me master anymore because you have drunk from the spring of knowledge that I have doled out. And from now on, you're my equal. Now, come apart from the others. I got something you're ready to hear now." And so he went to a distance and he told Thomas three things. Doesn't tell us what they were. And then Jesus departs, and the other disciples rush over to Thomas and gather around him and say, "What did he tell you?" And he says, "I'm sorry, guys, but if I told you even one of the things he told me, you would pick up stones to stone me to death for blasphemy. And if you did, well, fire would erupt from those stones and consume you." Good God, what could it have been? Well, the Gnostics had some theories about it, and I'm guessing we can generally say it was the basics of Gnosticism that I'm about to explain. But he said even the other apostles weren't ready for this, or they'd have said what Thomas did. And that if they heard what Jesus said, that ignorance would dispose them to think, this guy's a blasphemer. We can't have him around. And then I think of a saying in Matthew, I think it's Matthew, where he says, don't throw your pearls before swine or consecrated food before pigs, lest dogs, I should say, because if you do, the pigs and the dogs will trample them underfoot and turn on you to attack you and tear you to pieces. What pearls is he talking about? The pearls of wisdom, of gnosis. And the implication of the analogy is that those who are conventionally pious, but outside the charmed circle of the true gnosis, they're not going to react well. So don't start blabbing. What would you do to spread the word? Did the Gnostics care about that? Well, yeah, they did. They spoke of Gnostic revealers, kind of like Morpheus in the Matrix, which is explicitly based on Gnosticism, by the way. So what would they do? Well, I think of the story of the rich young ruler. This young religious guy comes up to Jesus and says, Master, you know all this stuff. What would I have to do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says, well, you know the commandments, don't you? He lists a few of them. And the guy says, oh, yes, I've known those and kept them faithfully ever since I was a kid. But is there something I'm still lacking? And Jesus says, well, as a matter of fact, yes. And he says, you need to give up all that you have and come follow me, be one of my disciples, because then you'll be in a position to learn this. But you have to depart from the masses. And I'm guessing that was the secret teaching of Jesus that the Gnostics claimed. In fact, later the apostles say to Jesus, why are you always teaching the crowd in parables and figures of speech? Why don't you just come out with it? And Jesus says, well, to quote Isaiah, the reason I teach as I do is that it says, having eyes, nonetheless they can't see. Having ears, nonetheless they can't hear. If they did, they would repent or turn around and I would heal them. But for you, you have, you do understand, or you should anyway. It says the things I have to tell you, ancient prophets and kings longed to learn, but God told them, no, it's not for you. It's for people in the future. Well, that's the gnosis. And even there, it doesn't tell you he says, it's been given to you to know the mystery of the kingdom of God. What is it? Well, I think it's partly Gnosticism. But at any rate, that sets the stage for why and how this was elite stuff. What were the basics? Well, Gnosticism was an attempt ultimately to solve the problem of evil. We always hear that God is good and that he created the world. But if he did, would the world be as it is? With all the natural disasters and the what does Hamlet say? The thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. What about all the inhumanity of man, all the violence and evil? How do you get from a righteous creator to a world full of this? And they said, well, maybe it's not so simple. Maybe the ultimate God didn't create this. Maybe somebody else did. And so they said there's a difference between as the Valentinians said, the unknowable Father and the ultimate Godhead, and then the demiurge. And the demiurge was the creator, and he was not perfect as the unknown Father was and is. So how do you get from the Father to the demiurge? Well, they said, and this I think they kind of borrowed from Neoplatonism. They said that God was emanating from himself uh, in pairs, um, what were called ions, also syzygies, which means yoke fellows, because there were two at each stage. And each had names, and they had them all cataloged. There were 365 of them, according to Valentinus. And of course, that had to do with the solar calendar, but let's leave that aside. Each pair emanated the next pair. And so you had in the final analysis the pleroma, or the fullness of spirit and light constituted by the Father, and the ions whom he emanated. And one was called the Christ. And so, you're going to hear from him again. One is the primordial man, the man of light. You find him in Philo of Alexandria. You find him later in the Jewish Kabbalah. You find him in the Rig Veda, where he is Purusha, the primal man who sacrificed himself in the heavens to create gods, mortals, and worlds, and so forth. You find him in Zoroastrianism as Gaiomard, the primordial man, who then was split into male and female and begat and bore the rest of the human race, and so forth. You've got this all over the ancient Near East. Okay. At the end of the process, notice I just said there were 365 ions, so it's an odd number. They were emanated in pairs, and each begat, figuratively, the next. Well, finally, the last emanation was of one single ion, known as Chochmah in Hebrew, or Sophia in Greek, wisdom, depicted as Lady Wisdom, perhaps a kind of a philosophized version of Isis, who knows. And she didn't want to be at the end of the process, because she was on the very border of the pleroma, outside of which was the kenoma, or the emptiness, the void. And she was so far away from the Father, she was basically ignorant. She didn't know the gnosis herself. And so she wanted to penetrate the limit, as they called it. If you're familiar with Jack Kirby's mythology and the Fourth World comics that he did, the New Gods, etc., he has the source wall that is impenetrable to those outside. I think that's based on the limit in Gnosticism. Kirby puts all kinds of esoterics, kinds of stuff into his comics, a modern myth maker. Well, she wanted to know what was in there, and she wanted to beget offspring of her own, to continue the emanations. Well, she manages somehow to conceive and bear an offspring, but it was defective, as they would have said. We try to be too polite to use such a thing. But the being she created was powerful but ignorant, and this was the demiurge. And he thought originally, hey, I am God, and he yells out through the void, "I am God, beside me there is no other," quoting from Isaiah. And Sophia, his mom, whom he doesn't even know how he got there, she laughs and says, "You don't know what you're talking about. Uh, Saklas, the fool, or Samael, the blind one," and so he still maintains that he is God, and he has some kind of intimation of how everything got there. So he decides, well, I'll do some creating. And so he somehow conjures into being the world of matter, but it's just, I guess, what Aristotle would have called prime matter. It's just the stuff. It's a kind of placid lake of mere muddy, slimy matter. So then he creates a bunch of stooges, the archons, to be his sort of counterfeits of the ions of the pleroma. They become his angels, the angels of God. The Gnostics, by the way, identified this demiurge with Yahweh Sabaoth, Jehovah, Lord of hosts. And one of the names they had, I just gave you two of them, Saklas and Samael, but they also called him Yaldabaoth, which was a garbled version of Yahweh Sabaoth. And so you can see why outsiders learning about this and say, wait a second, you're making God into a challenged, false God? Well, that would explain why the creation has so many problems. So what did he do I mean, everything he made was just inert. He shaped the gunk into animals and people and all that, but it was just like making clay effigies. Like Pinocchio before he became alive. How are we going to get something going here? How are we going to get him up and dancing? And there are two different Gnostic explanations for this. They amount to the same thing, sort of, but they're worth distinguishing. In Iranian Gnosticism, they had the idea that both said that the demiurge obtained sparks of the divine. I would just modernize and say the photons from the pleroma, the fullness of light. And they inserted these into the mud pie creations of the demiurge. And that vivified them and woke them up and made them able to move. And so it's a bit more complicated than this, but I do want to just give you the basic outlines. And where'd they get this light? Here's where the myths diverge. According to one school of thought, Sophia noticed that her son had created this inert world. And she was intrigued and went to look at this, well, actually the earlier stage, the mere placid surface of matter, like a lake without waves or ripples. And she looks into it and sees her own reflection. Well, she is a glowing, haloed being of light. And so her photons enter into the reflecting matter, and bingo, they're trapped. And this is how the demiurge gets a hold of them and starts placing them like batteries into toys that wouldn't function otherwise. Now, according to the other one, which is more relevant to Christianity because there were Christian Gnostics, and I think the comparative religion, the history of religion scholars like Bultmann and Reitzenstein and so forth were correct, that Gnosticism, pre-Christian Gnosticism, was one of the components of early Christianity. And so this is relevant. Where'd they get the photons from the Pleroma? Well, some of the henchmen of the demiurge, remember the archons, the rulers of this age, this world, they ambushed one of the ions, the primal man, the man of light, the Kabbalistic Adam Kadmon, the heavenly Adam. They mugged him, basically, and managed to tear away some of his light, and then the same thing. They placed it like batteries into the toys and got them moving again. Well, the man of light escaped and returned to the Pleroma, but resolved one day to come back to the material world to retrieve the missing parts of himself. This seems to go way back to the myths of Marduk and his fighting the dragons of chaos and being swallowed by them, but then escaping. And in some versions, he returns to disembowel them, to retrieve that part of him which the dragons had eaten. But at any rate, this is the origin of this part of the Gnostic myth is called that of the redeemed Redeemer, because this has to do with not only here's a couple of fancy words you can impress your friends with, the protology, the creation, cosmogony kind of a thing. How did we get this world and the human race? And eschatology, what is going to happen at the end, the last things, because the dismemberment of the primal man has everything to do with the creation of our world, and the retrieval of that material. It signals the end of this world, passing away to a better one. Okay, got to step back a bit. As I understand it, there was not enough of this stolen light, you might think of Prometheus here, to go around, so that though there was, I've never heard this explained sufficiently, so if you have the same question, I don't have an answer yet. But everybody had enough of this light to be sentient, but not everybody had one of the real sparks of the divine in them. Again, I don't know what the difference was. I think it's Mahayana Buddhism, which is very, very similar to this. They say everybody contains the Buddha nature and everyone can be enlightened. Personally, it seems to me Gnosticism would have been a little more consistent if it said that everybody has the spark of light, though few know it. Okay, those who have it experience this world as strangers in a strange land. It's a vale of tears, a realm of constant suffering. Why? Well, because the real them, the spark of the divine, is like a battery, slightly change the metaphor here, in a flashlight. The battery doesn't illuminate anything. The battery doesn't see anything, but it puts in place what the flashlight needs to be able to illuminate things. And that's what's happening with human beings who have the spark deep down. It enables them to see the world in all its pain, and so they are always pained. The world is revealed as a veil of suffering because one has the spark of light, though the spark itself is not pained or diminished, but it enables your ego self, your material self, right? Like, it may sound odd, but doesn't brain science teach us that even our thoughts are electrochemical impulses? Because these guys were right. The divine spark makes us aware, and therefore we suffer, and we begin to think this world is not where I belong, and this is like Neo in the Matrix. He knows there's got to be something more, and he's dissatisfied until Morpheus comes along and says, I know how you feel, and I felt that way too. I found the answer, and let me share the red pill with you. What do you think? And so the Gnostic who is told the truth about himself, his real divine origin, and his divine destiny, because now that he knows what he really is, he has the secret to stop being reincarnated in this world of tears, to throw off the impediment of the body, which, as Socrates said, was the prison house of the soul. And at the death of this body, the enlightened Gnostic, the pneumatic, the one with the pneuma, the one with the spirit, the pneumatic, will ascend back to his place of origin, the pleroma of light. The Gnostic who is yet unaware of what is wrong. Why am I feeling this way? He's unaware of it. No one has let him in on the secret. Sadly, he or she is going to be reincarnated again and again until they learn the truth. The disciples in the Gospel of Thomas come to Jesus and say, tell us about our end. Tell us what our end will be. And Jesus says, I love this. He says, have you learned about the beginning that you're asking about the end? Because he who knows the beginning also knows the end. Like, if you realize, hey, I am really a child of the pleroma. Well, okay, that's your first step toward regaining that bliss. You got to know where you come from, what you really are, before you can be liberated and attain that reunion with the pleroma. So there are, and this led Valentinus to divide humanity into three categories, which is, I think, implicit in all Gnosticism. On the top rung of the ladder are the pneumatics, those with the spirit. They can understand the gnosis, the knowledge, and based on that, they can be brought back to the pleroma. And in the meantime, they realize, geez, the God I used to worship, he's no God. I was being kept down and deceived, kept in the dark. Well, I'm not going to do that anymore. And this meant these pneumatics, these true Gnostics, they didn't believe that the Torah laws, for instance, were incumbent on them. They don't bind me. These are the laws given by the demiurge and the archons. And they have their point. Yes, I'd rather see order than chaos, but I am not, there's no danger of that for me. So I am free of those laws and of all fleshly attachments. From this point, Gnostics divided into two streams of practice. Most Gnostics were ascetics, that is, they tried to mortify the flesh, sometimes with extreme measures, like a lot of the desert hermits did. They ate only enough to stay alive. They might live as hermits, no social contact. They might deny themselves sleep. They might not wash. and so on and so forth. But they also didn't need the standard rituals of religion. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, "What regimen would you have us observe? Should we fast? Should we pray? Should we give alms?" And Jesus says, "If you fast, you will do evil to your spirits. If you pray, you will be damned," and so on and so forth, because that's over with. That's only for the underlings. You're beyond that. You don't need that to be holy. But there was apparently a minority of Gnostics who were libertines. And they said, "You mean all those strictures about what you can and can't do sexually? I don't have to worry about that anymore? I mean, it's just the flesh, right? It doesn't really matter what you do with it. That's the property of the demiurge. We don't have to do what he says." There apparently were such wild Gnostics, and of course they were very controversial, and even the more ascetic Gnostics didn't approve of that. But they certainly gave Gnostics a bad name and did all kinds of wacky stuff, and including religious orgies and so forth and so forth. Okay, now back to the threefold category. People who are sentient and are observing the religious and moral dictates of the archons and the demiurge, and they're trying to be righteous, and these laws help them to be good citizens and pious believers. They don't, however, have the true knowledge. They don't know there's a God above the demiurge whom they think is God. And these are called the psychikoi, which is based on the word psyche, of course, which can mean life or soul or nature. So there you see them variously translated as the natural man, or the soulish one, or the psychic person. But that's probably not the best word to use, because we think of, paranormal powers. That's not what they had in mind. So the conventional non-Gnostics, they were good people, but they didn't know the real truth, and they would continue to be reincarnated, which is kind of a bad trip. Well, the third group, as you might guess, were called the carnal ones, or the hylics, which means the material, or literally the wooden ones. They were sentient, but they lived only for the flesh. And basically, they were two-legged animals, like trained monkeys or dogs. And they didn't really care for spiritual things. They could be vicious. Criminals certainly must be among the sarkikoi, or carnal ones, or the hylics, whatever. And they're just going to be damned. Now, what about the middle group? They're reincarnated, right? But Christian Gnostics said, actually, there is a kind of a track two, a sort of a plan B for them. This is, again, very much like Hinduism and Buddhism. In both of those, they say, if you live in accordance with the basic ethics of our religion, you will go to the next rung on the possible worlds of reincarnation. You may be reborn in a higher caste. You may become a Brahmin. You may, or a lower one, you may be an animal or a ghost or whatever. And Buddhism would say the same thing. But even if you are very righteous, you can ascend to become a god and live in heaven. And in Buddhism, it would be you become a bodhisattva, but it amounts to the same thing. But even at that, you have not reached the ultimate, which is realizing your primordial unity with the Brahman in Hinduism, or the Buddha nature in Mahayana Buddhism. So Gnostics are saying the same thing. They plan on attaining to the pleroma. But what about the people that are not, really tuned in to the Gnostic truth? Well, Christ died, Jesus, I should say, died for them. And if they have faith in him, they will go to a blessed existence in heaven. But that's not the ultimate level. They think it is, and for them it may turn out that way, but there is something higher, the pleroma, and not the heaven of the archons, which won't be bad, but it's not the real ultimate thing, which is unity with God in the pleroma. Now, what about Jesus? Who was he in Gnosticism? Well, many types of Gnosticism featured a Gnostic redeemer, namely the returning man of light, who comes back at some point to regather all the divine sparks. And when he does, the world itself will revert to its original form of just a heap of raw matter. So he's sort of the destroyer and the redeemer at the same time. And Jesus, of course, is, I think, has been shaped according to this. And but the Gnostic redeemer, at least when he comes as the revealer, seems to be a man, a human. Well, if he only seems to be, but doesn't have an actual material body, that's what they call docetism, from dokeo, to seem. And so the Gnostic redeemer might not have flesh. I mean, he might, but it would, like in the hymn of the pearl in the Acts of Thomas, the Gnostic redeemer assumes a coating of flesh to enter into the world he is going to try to extricate the sparks from. But as soon as he's freed from it, he strips it off like a filthy garment and returns as a pure spirit to the pleroma. But as you can see, that amounts to the same sort of thing. Some Gnostics believe that about Jesus. Others view Jesus as a kind of a channeler, to use modern New Age terms. He was a real human being, but when the Spirit descended into him at his baptism, and that's what Mark says, Matthew, Luke, and John all have the Spirit descend upon him and rest upon him. But Mark, the earliest gospel, has the Spirit descend into him. And the early Gnostics said, well, that has to mean that this is what made Jesus the amazing character he was. He was the unique bearer of the Spirit, the channeler for the Spirit. And that explains what he was saying on the cross. Jesus, the man, was crucified, and he says at the height of his torment, my God, why have you forsaken me? Gnostics took that to mean that the Christ Spirit abandoned him and returned to the pleroma. But the death of the man, Jesus, was the basis for the heaven-bound salvation of the sukikoi, the second level believers. Whereas the Christ Spirit need not hang around to experience the death, probably couldn't die anyway, but that's okay because his task was finished. He had appeared and entered into Jesus to teach the true gnosis to humans as a human or through the lips of a human. So so Gnostics had a couple of different ideas. That he was kind of a phantom, a hologram without flesh, or the Christ was being channeled by the human Jesus. Very, very interesting stuff, I think. Now, what else do we need to know about Gnosticism? How they were organized. It appears that Gnostics generally met in small study groups, though some of them, like the Valentinians, were also faithful church attenders. But they did keep mum on what they ultimately believed because they knew what reaction they would get. But they considered themselves Christians, as I say. And but church leaders like Irenaeus in the late 2nd century really would rather these Gnostics go their own way and not attend church where they might, God forbid, start spreading their heresy and whispers to other naive believers. Irenaeus complains that he can't really smoke them out because they go to the services along with other literalistic Christians, and they appreciate it. They consider themselves Christians, but they know more. They know the real meaning of it. But he doesn't think there is any realer meaning than the stuff in the creed, and he just as soon as they get the hell out of the church, which most did, right? Most Gnostics had their own meetings, but the Valentinians, at least, and probably some others, formed little groups within a church. Very much, I don't know if any of you were involved in the Catholic charismatic movement in the 70s, but often there'd be a small charismatic prayer group in a parish, and they would faithfully attend mass, but they would also one weeknight get together to pray and prophesy and speak in tongues and so forth. But they were loyal Catholics. Presumably these Valentinians were too. And luckily, they were pretty much accepted by the church hierarchy. But the Gnostics were not. One downside of that approach was the approach Irenaeus didn't like. Was that you might be safer from persecution once the authorities became Christian, like under Constantine. Whereas if you went to First Gnostic down the block, they might say, "Oh no, you're heretics. We're persecuting you," and so that's why they got more bad attention. Okay, I wonder if I need to say anything else. They apparently coexisted pretty well, some of them, because like the monks of the monastery of Saint Pachomius in Nag Hammadi, or as it was then known, Cenobaskia in Egypt, their library contained books from all different Gnostic perspectives and Hermetic literature, Zoroastrian, and so forth. But then again, in those very documents, we have harsh polemics aimed at one Gnostic group against another it didn't agree with. So it's about what you'd expect from any pluralistic religious movement that's had time enough to develop and mutate into different versions, which, of course, I think is a good thing. Let 100 flowers bloom. You don't have to hate each other to accept that not everybody agrees with you. Okay, well, I guess that's about it then, for all I can think of to say about it at the moment. I hope that helps. Please let me know if it does not, and if I can clarify things anymore. Let me see if there are questions germane to what I've said here. I know there is back and forth chat, which is certainly good. Wave of Mutilation says, I love your superhero collection. You ain't seen nothing yet, my friend. Sometime I'd have a video tour of the whole rooms devoted to that at Shea Price. Yeah. Slick Trick says there are many paths to wisdom, but wisdom is the only path to God. I like that. What about kindness? Well, it's wise to be kind. Slick Trick saith, notice, gosh, come on, glasses, don't fail me now. I notice that in that logion or saying from Thomas, Jesus takes Thomas aside, but only Thomas returns. Where did Jesus disappear to? Jesus was Judas Thomas, the physical twin to the divine Christ consciousness. I've heard it put the other way around, that Thomas is the twin of Jesus. Well, and that's kind of what this particular saying says, that you're my equal now, and that Thomas the twin was often taken to mean that he was spiritually the image of Jesus, and that everybody can be the twin. Lots of different ways of putting it. Jesus Tales says, the angel of the Lord disappears like that in Judges 2, and suddenly Jesus, the son of Nun, is there. Yeah, there's some interesting overlap, whether symbolically or whatever, between Jesus and Joshua, son of Nun. I think I did an article in the Journal of Higher Criticism. It's funny, everything I submit to that journal gets published. I guess that's because I'm the editor. At any rate, I did an article called the Old Testament Origins of Docetic Christology, where I said the early Christians simply thought Jesus was the angel of Yahweh. But anyway, let's see. Slick Trick says Jesus appears and disappears a lot in early texts. Easy to do that when you exist only on the spiritual plane, right? That is a big sign of Docetism. Slick Trick was in the path of the hurricane, and from Jesus Tales asks him how the cleanup from Helena went, or Helene, whatever it was. He said, still got a pile of yard debris out front waiting for the county to come pick it up. Otherwise, everything is back to normal. Power was out for 5 days, but better than most of my neighbors. He says that's good news. Glad to hear it. Wave of Mutilation says, I love King Kirby. Amen. Jesus Tales says women are associated with wisdom in many cultures unless they run for U.S. president. She might be the exception that proves the rule. Wave of Mutilation says new gods blew my mind. Jesus Tales says, was Gnosticism a rejection of Platonism, where the world was created perfect and fails more the further it goes from its creator? Well, it's really saying something similar. In Plato has a higher view of the demiurge, and so the world isn't a piece of junk coming out of his hands. And but yeah, all matter is doomed to disintegrate and degrade. And so, just because it is matter, so if you can have a material world, it's going to degenerate. So I like the phrase that I thought I had made up, but then I was gratified to realize some real Gnosticism scholar had already come up with it. Said Gnosticism is Platonism run riot. Uh, um, Plotinus, who came up with Neoplatonism, he had Gnostic students, but he did not care for Gnosticism because he didn't like the idea that matter was inherently evil. So there was sometimes some friction and disagreement, but they're certainly related. Sleep Trick says Gnosticism is simply knowing everything that is knowing. I'm sorry, it's knowing everything beyond that is window dressing and not important. Let's see. He says there's no such thing as free will for Gnostics. Born divine, they will not taste death. Sleep Trick says the Gospel of Thomas is shaded heavily against Judaism, though it seems to be a mixed bag in some sayings, like unless you keep the Sabbath as Sabbath, you will not see the kingdom of the Father. That can easily be taken to mean that you better be a good Sabbatarian, but there are other Gospel of Thomas sayings that are diametrically opposed. Oh, let me see. Great stream wave of mutilation says thanks for sharing. Slick Trick says Judas didn't turn Jesus over to the Romans to be crucified. When the Roman soldiers showed up to collect Jesus, Judas was the only man in that room. Judas dies simultaneously with Jesus dying. Yeah, fascinating. Fascinating. I wonder if there's an ancient version of that. But what you're doing is, if there isn't an ancient version of that, you are further evolving the Gnostic mytheme, it seems to me. I like to hear stuff like that, further Gnosticizing speculations. Okay, what do we got here? Richard Windish is the Gospel of Truth from Nag Valentinian. Yeah, I accept the authorship claim that it is the work of Valentinus himself. And let's see. Good talk, Doctor. Thank you, Slick. Well, my voice needs a rest, and we've come through the whole thing. I hope Gnosticism is less mystifying. I know it is to me every time I talk about it. It comes into better perspective. So I'll see you at 6 p.m. for the question and answer session of the Bible Geek.